Today I'm testing out different ways to get hyperlapses and I'll work out which one's best. These are very different ways to get hyperlapses, but are all valid ways as well, especially when there's enough light about. I basically want to see if the effort is worth it with a mirrorless camera and a gimbal, or if it's just as good to walk around with a 360 camera or an action camera to get the hyperlapse I need for my video. With the Insta360 One X, you just turn it on, select video mode, press record and start walking. It films the whole sphere, and then you do all of your editing and shot selection in post, from the angle you're shooting to the speed at which you set the hyperlapse. The great thing with this is that you can frame up your shot after the fact, so if you see anything interesting, you don't have to suddenly reframe that shot. You do this afterwards, and you just make a mental note of what you want to move around. You do have to have it on the pole provided and extend it fully so you don't get in the frame, but it can produce some interesting results. If you control the camera with a phone app, you can also set the camera to manual, so this gives you more control over the settings. I found this to be the better way, as when you shoot it in auto, it would really bump up the exposure in the shadows. You can see that in this sequence that I'm showing you now. When you process the video into a hyperlapse, you can add motion blur to it in that app. And this does kind of add to that hyperlapse effect. Now with the phone app, it does take ages to process any hyperlapse, as it's taking real-time video footage and making it into a hyperlapse. It took about 10 minutes to put in all of the pivot points to keep it looking the right way, even though I'd calibrated the actual Insta360 One X. And then another 25 minutes for it to completely export this sequence. And you can't preview the hyperlapse either. You have to wait until it has processed the final file before seeing whether or not it has worked. Also, even though I had set it to 25 frames per second, the app would then kind of choose its own frame rate. I had one which exported at 30 frames a second, another at 29.96 frames per second, and then another at 25 frames a second. This really should be standardized. Whatever frame rate I import, this should be the same frame rate exported. This just seems to be a lack of understanding by the programmers on how frame rates and filming works. When it comes to the disadvantages, the main one is the resolution. At 5.7K for the whole sphere, this may sound a lot, but when you crop into your 16:9 frame, a lot of those pixels are lost, and so the image quality is questionable. When shooting a hyperlapse with a GoPro, unless you have it on a gimbal, you have to shoot it in the Timewarp mode. This is a strange mode as it seems to change the speed of your sequence you shoot, and quite randomly as well. I had it in auto speed and it kept on slowing it down in random places throughout the sequence. Even when I changed the speed to just ×30, it still did it a couple of times. This was annoying as hyperlapses tend to be at a constant speed. If I'm shooting a hyperlapse, I want it at that speed. So if I tell the camera I want it at ×30, it should stay at ×30 and not change down to slow-mo and then come back up again. I get the idea of what it's doing, but I want to make those editing choices afterwards. I don't want the camera to choose some random points to stop and start the hyperlapse. However, when it does keep a constant speed, you can get a good sequence with it. It doesn't give you the motion blur that the Insta360 app applies to its sequence, but it does stabilize it really well. And if you have a decent program like Final Cut Pro or Adobe After Effects, you can add that motion blur afterwards. So this is kind of in between the other two ways of shooting. It's not as fully automated as the Insta360 when filming, but it isn't as manual as the mirrorless camera with a gimbal. Also, unlike the Insta360, you won't have to edit it afterwards and you won't have to choose it all afterwards. It's all ready to go in the camera. Nowadays, most mobile phones can shoot high quality hyperlapses, especially when the light is good. I've installed the Microsoft Hyperlapse mobile app for my Android phone, but if you have an iPhone, you can use the built-in time-lapse function or Instagram's Hyperlapse app. Looking back at the footage, some of it was passable and some of it was pretty awful. With my Huawei P30 Pro, the Microsoft Hyperlapse mobile app was about the worst footage I've ever seen. There was loads of jello at the edges and it kind of did this random cropping in and pulling out. It was kind of strange. I think it was just trying too hard to stabilize the shot and completely getting it wrong. Also, it was only outputting at 1280 by 720. So this app is definitely living in the dark ages. The time-lapse function on the P30 Pro is also rubbish for hyperlapses. There's no stabilization, and it's purely for time lapses where the camera is completely still, maybe on a tripod or where you balance it against a wall. But as soon as you start moving that camera, it gets all of those jitters and all those movements in the sequence, and it doesn't stabilize them out. You could in theory shoot it in this time-lapse mode and put the camera on a gimbal, but this defeats the ease of use of using that camera phone. With the iPhone, and I was using the iPhone 7, it did surprisingly well. The Hyperlapse app from Instagram was quite jittery, and I was quite surprised at how jittery it was. But the built-in time-lapse function in the phone camera app did the best. Now, even though there isn't any motion blur on it, the stabilization does a really good job at smoothing out the footage. Now, I think the newer iPhones would probably do an even better job as well, because the iPhone 7 is quite old now. I'm an Android user, so I was hoping that this was going to be a complete failure, but I was pleasantly surprised. For this option, I used the A7 III and the Feiyutech AK2000C, but this could be any camera on a gimbal that keeps a steady position. It will give you the best quality and dynamic range, but does take a lot to set up and shoot properly. You are also limited to how you can move the camera around in your environment, unlike those other options that I've already showed you. I just wish the gimbal companies would give us a super slow movement option where it would pan, tilt or roll over a really long time and would iron out any of the erratic movements. And I'm talking super slow, like about a minute to turn around a corner where you pan or tilt. This would then simplify the process, and it would give us the option to make some super cool movements in hyperlapses. In saying that, the tracking option in the DJI RS2 does allow you to track around a building or an object. You set the tracking on a certain point and it will stick to that. The only downside I could see to this is if something comes in between you and your subject, but this seems like a really good option. You do also need an ND filter if you want to get the motion blur in your shots. This really smooths out any of the jitters in the sequence and can give some really nice results. I shot a few of these sequences with a 1/2 second shutter speed and then sped the shutter up to about 1/4 of a second to reduce the motion blur slightly. And this is one of the things with shooting hyperlapses like this. You have to experiment with those settings to kind of get the look that you want. So this does come with experience in knowing what shutter speed to use and what ND to use. Now, if you plan it properly, this does produce the best quality hyperlapse, but it does take a lot of time and effort. From setting it up to editing, there was a lot to think about, and with the built-in interval mode, you can produce a raw sequence with loads of latitude for editing. And also, with 6,000 pixels along the long edge, this was basically a 6K image, so loads of resolution that you can crop into. Now, the downside to this is unless you have the tracking function, like with the DJI RS2, with that unit that connects it to the phone app, you do have to lock the gimbal off and not move it at all. This means a lot of planning to get the hyperlapse you want, but if you want to put the effort in, all you do is switch it to the locked off mode, switch the camera to interval mode or use an intervalometer, work out where you're going to walk to, set your framing, and then walk slowly and steadily from your start point to your end point. If you do all this and you take your time, you will get a really good sequence. With the Insta360 One X, this was the easiest to film with, but it didn't really produce great results. I think on an electric skateboard going slow, you'd get a smoother hyperlapse. It just seems to accentuate the bobbing motion of me walking, and I was trying to hold it quite steady. Using the GoPro, it was simple and straightforward to shoot. The stabilization was applied to the preview on the back of the camera, so as I was filming it, it looked nice and steady. The only downside was how the camera kept changing the speed of the sequence at random through the sequence that I'd filmed. So I'd be reviewing it on the back, it would be at the hyperlapse speed that I'd set, and all of a sudden it would slow down. So this was really annoying. And if there is a way to fix this, and if you know of a way to fix this, Let me know in the comments below. If the GoPro didn't have this, it would be so much better to shoot hyperlapses with. Now my Android phone is a no-go at the moment, so if you do know of any apps that work well for hyperlapses, let me know in the comments below. The P30 Pro has that processing power, so in theory it should be able to do it really well, but I couldn't find one that worked. The biggest surprise for me was the built-in time-lapse function in the iPhone camera app. This stabilized it really well and produced some really good results. It didn't have any motion blur, but it produced a very usable hyperlapse. Lastly, with a camera and a gimbal, this can produce some great results, but you do have to plan it well, as well as spending a lot of time editing and compiling the sequence. But if you want that super high quality hyperlapse, this is the way to go. Also, if you're filming in low light or at night time, this is the only real option that's viable, as that big sensor can cope much better in those darker conditions. If you try shooting at night time with the GoPro or with the Insta360 or even your camera phone, it doesn't produce that good a sequence. Now this wasn't really a fair test, but it does show you how in photography and videography, it's all about putting in that effort. Some ways of producing clips will be really easy and straightforward, but the quality won't quite be there. Whereas if you put the time and effort in, you can produce some really great sequences. It just all depends on how much of a commitment you want to make. Now what do you think? Have you shot any hyperlapses before? Are you interested in doing them? If so, let me know in the comments below. It'll be great to hear your thoughts. Also, if there's another way you shoot them, again, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more, click on this video next. Or if you want to binge watch a load of my tutorials, click down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography and videography. I'll see you next time.